All right. Ready to dive into some seriously thought-provoking stuff? We're tackling Paul M. Churchland's Scientific Realism and the Plasticity of Mind today. This one's a doozy.
Oh, absolutely. Churchland doesn't hold back. He basically says, what if our whole understanding of the world, even our common sense, needs a major system update?
Okay, whoa, hold on. Common sense. That seems fairly reliable, like most of the time anyway.
Okay.
What's he got against common sense?
He says we rely on a framework, right? Even when we think we're just, observing things objectively. He calls it folk psychology.
Folk psychology sounds quaint.
Yeah, well, it's basically our everyday ingrained understanding of emotions, desires, beliefs,
Yeah.
all the stuff we use to figure out why people do what they do.
So, like, if I see someone grinning ear to ear, my folk psychology tells me they're probably happy.
Exactly. And sure, that works
Mm.
for basic everyday stuff, right? But Churchland argues that it's a super limited system, especially when you're trying to really get the mind. He even compares our brains to, get this, measuring instruments.
Interesting. Our brains are like thermometers.
Think about it. A thermometer needs the right scale to make sense, right? Like those little lines and numbers only mean something because we decided they represent specific temperatures.
Okay, I see. So you're saying our senses are kind of similar, like they need the right concepts to make sense of the information they're getting.
Exactly. Our brains come preloaded with a certain way of interpreting the world, which works to a point. But what if that framework, that folk psychology, is, due for an upgrade?
Okay, now you've got me really curious. What would an upgrade even look like? How do we go beyond our current programming?
Well, Churchland uses this thought experiment, right? Imagine a species that doesn't feel temperature like we do, but sees it as colors.
So, like, their cold drinks would look blue, hot stoves are glowing red, their whole reality is based on this color system.
Yeah, and their common sense would be built around that, right?
Yeah.
And here's the kicker. While their framework might help them get by day to day, it would be technically wrong.
Because they're not perceiving temperature directly, but just this translated version of it.
Exactly. And what Churchland is getting at is maybe our perception of reality, even the way we think about our own minds, is like that too. Maybe it's limited by our senses and the framework we've got.
So what we perceive as objective reality might just be one interpretation, one way of looking at things. That's a pretty mind-blowing thought. And a little unsettling, right? Because if our common sense understanding of our own minds is flawed, how do we even begin to understand what's going on in other people's heads?
That's a good question. It's like the classic problem of other minds dilemma, only now it seems even trickier. We can't just ask someone to show us their internal experience, can we?
Nope. We rely on these external cues, on interpreting words and actions, which are all filtered through our own potentially flawed frameworks.
Okay, so if our current software has all these limitations, what's the alternative? What does Churchland suggest we use to replace it?
Well, he makes this really interesting comparison, right? Between how we understand the mind now and how people used to understand the physical world.
Okay, like what? Give me an example. So remember the caloric theory of heat, where they thought heat was this fluid, like caloric, that flowed from one thing to another.
Oh, right, right. Like heat was a substance, not just, energy or
Yeah,
whatever.
exactly. And you know what? It kind of made sense at the time. They had all these like laws about how caloric fluid worked, why metal felt hotter than wood, why things expanded when heated. It all seemed to fit
So what happened? Why'd they ditch the caloric idea?
because a better theory came along, the kinetic theory of heat, which is all about, the motion of molecules. It just explained things way more accurately and completely.
It's wild how a whole way of seeing things, observations, explanations, can be built on an idea that turns out to be, like, totally off base.
And that is Churchland's point, exactly. Our current folk psychology, all this talk about beliefs and desires to explain the mind, might be just as limited, just as off as that whole caloric thing. Like we're missing a whole other level of how to even think about it.
Okay, so then if folk psychology is like our caloric theory, what's the mind's version of the kinetic theory? What does Churchland propose we use instead?
He's putting his money on neuroscience. He thinks as we figure out the brain, really unravel it, we'll develop a whole new language for understanding ourselves, one that goes way beyond this folk psychology stuff.
So instead of talking about like feeling happy, we describe a specific pattern of neurons firing.
Exactly. Just like we went from this invisible fluid to actual, molecular motion. We might go from fuzzy feelings to the nitty-gritty of what those feelings actually are in the brain.
Wouldn't that, like, I don't know, diminish our inner experience though? Make it cold and mechanical, just neurons firing.
That's a common worry. But Churchland says, no, no, that's a misunderstanding. He's not saying our feelings are fake, just that the way we describe them now is super limited.
The feeling's still real, but we'd understand it, talk about it in a totally different way.
Exactly. Think of trying to explain the color red to someone who's been blind since birth. It's almost impossible because they've never had that sensory experience.
Yeah.
We might be the same with our own consciousness lacking the right framework to truly get it.
It'd be like trying to explain a symphony by listing out every single note. You'd miss the harmony, the emotion, the whole point.
Yes, exactly. What if there's this whole other level of understanding of experiencing our own minds that we're just blind to right now? Because we don't have the tools to even perceive it.
Okay, wow. That's both fascinating and kind of terrifying. So how do we even begin to bridge that gap from folk psychology to this, like, deeper understanding?
Churchland sees it as a process. As neuroscience gets better, new concepts, new ways of talking about this stuff will emerge. We'll incorporate them slowly.
So it's not like we'll all just wake up one day and suddenly be thinking in terms of neural networks. It's an evolution.
Right. Think about how scientific discoveries have reshaped how we see the universe. We went from a flat Earth to, a sphere orbiting the sun, and that wasn't overnight. Took time, accumulating knowledge, revising what we thought we knew.
Are you suggesting that folk psychology, this understanding of the mind we have now, might someday seem as outdated as those old maps with "here be dragons" on them? Quaint, but ultimately, wrong.
Now, that is a fantastic analogy. And just like exploring the world led to better maps, right? Exploring the brain will lead to, well, a better understanding of ourselves.
Which leads to another question. If our internal software is constantly being updated, if our understanding of even logic itself could change, then what can we really rely on? What even is knowledge in a system that's so fluid, so open to revision? So if our understanding of the mind, even logic itself, could be due for a revision, what does Churchland offer as a solid foundation? What can we actually rely on if everything's up for grabs?
Well, that's where it gets really interesting. Instead of searching for this, unshakable bedrock of certainty, Churchland says, maybe we've got it all wrong. Maybe clinging to the idea of fixed absolute truths. That's the mistake.
Okay, I did not see that coming. So where does he point us instead? If not towards some ultimate truth, then what?
Nature. He says, look at how other systems in the world, like natural systems, acquire and use information.
Interesting. Give me an example. Let me wrap my head around this.
All right, picture a simple organism. Something in, say, a tidal environment.
Okay, got it. Like I'm imagining a crab scuttling along the shore.
Perfect. Now that crab, it doesn't need to understand lunar cycles or the laws of gravity to survive the tides coming in and out, right?
Right. It doesn't need a physics textbook.
Exactly. It just needs to develop these internal mechanisms that can track the patterns, right? Allow it to predict what's going to happen and then, adapt.
So through trial and error, through adapting to its environment, the crab gains this practical knowledge, even though it doesn't have a conscious understanding of what's going on, does it?
Nope. And Churchland thinks maybe our brains, while obviously way more complex, maybe they work on a similar principle. We're adapting these neural networks to reflect the patterns we encounter. And that's how we make predictions, how we navigate the world.
So instead of trying to create this perfect, unchanging model of reality in our heads,
we're constantly updating, revising, refining based on new information. Exactly.
But that sounds messy. Isn't that a weakness? That our knowledge is always shifting, changing?
That's what's so cool. Churchland says, no, that's the beauty of it. It allows for adaptation, for learning from mistakes. It's what makes the evolution of understanding even possible.
Okay, so uncertainty then becomes a feature, not a bug.
100%. He says, embrace the uncertainty. Recognize that everything we know is a work in progress, always open to revision.
So we move away from knowledge as this fixed, set in stone thing, and we embrace this more dynamic, constantly evolving view.
That's the heart of his scientific realism. It's not about clinging to some ultimate truth. It's about testing, revising, getting closer and closer to understanding how things really are.
It's a much more humble approach to knowledge, admitting we don't have it all figured out, but also recognizing the incredible potential for growth, for discovery.
Right, and he even challenges us to imagine entirely new ways of knowing, ones that might go beyond our current concepts of language, of logic, of everything we think we know about knowing.
Wow. Okay, so after this deep dive into Churchland and the plasticity of mind, Where does that leave us? What's the takeaway for listeners?
I think he leaves us with a challenge more than a definitive answer. He's saying, hey, become an explorer of your own mind. Question everything, embrace the uncertainty, and realize your internal software is never truly finished. Be open to those upgrades.
It's a call to recognize just how powerful the human mind truly is, but also to approach everything with a bit of humility, a sense of curiosity, and a whole lot of openness to the unknown. I feel like my internal software just got a serious upgrade. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. And until next time, keep those minds flexible and those questions coming.